The morning she walked into Camp Bravo, the air smelled like diesel fuel and bad decisions. A dry desert wind pushed dust across the compound in lazy spirals, and the men standing near the operations tent did what men at forward operating bases always do when they think no one is watching. They stared, they judged, and they whispered just loud enough to feel brave. She was limping. Not the dramatic movie-style limp that earns gasps and hero music. This was quieter than that, and a slightly uneven stride. A left foot that landed a half beat behind the right, like a song with one note missing. She wore standard issue fatigues, no rank displayed on the front, a worn canvas bag hanging from her right shoulder. Her hair was pulled back tight enough to hurt. Her face gave nothing away. Not pain, not awareness of the stairs, not the faintest flicker of caring what anyone thought about her arrival. She walked past the row of vehicles without stopping, past the fuel depot, past the cluster of 4 men near the operations tent, who had paused their conversation entirely to track her path across the compound. One of them, a broad man named Taggart, 12 years in special operations, 3 combat deployments, a chest full of commendations he never talked about, and a mouth that never stopped, turned to the man beside him and said what they were all thinking. "Support staff," he said. "Logistics, maybe. Someone left the desk job open." The man beside him, I called Reeves, said nothing. He just watched her walk. There was something in the way she moved that snagged at the edge of his attention, some detail he couldn't quite name. The limp should have made her look diminished. It didn't. She walked like someone who had been broken before and had rebuilt herself on purpose, with better materials. But Reeves didn't say that out loud. He just looked away. She checked in at the administration post with a single folder of documents and a name the clerk had trouble pronouncing. Captain Mara Voss. The clerk looked at the paperwork, looked at her, looked at the paperwork again, the way people do when they expect the words on the page to eventually make more sense. "You're assigned to the Alpha Team briefing," he said. "Tomorrow, 0600. "I know," she said. She walked to the quarters she'd been assigned, a narrow room with a metal cot, a single overhead light, and a window that faced the compound wall. And she set her bag down on the floor. She did not unpack. She sat on the edge of the cot, and for a long moment she was completely still, the way only people who have learned to be invisible in dangerous places can be still. Her left leg ached. It always ached, had ached for 2 years, ever since the IED on the Kandahar Road rearranged the bones of her lower leg into a configuration that 3 surgeries had mostly, but not entirely, corrected. The doctors had used words like remarkable recovery and exceptional threshold, and we've genuinely never seen anyone push through that protocol at this rate. She had heard all of it and gone back to her physical therapy sessions and done what she always did. More than was asked, less complaining than was expected, and zero discussion of what it cost her in private hours when the leg throbbed like something with its own angry heartbeat. She had been cleared for field operations 8 months ago. The clearance had taken 14 months of fighting, not with enemies, but with medical boards and administrative committees and well-meaning senior officers who looked at her limp and saw a liability instead of looking at her record and seeing what was actually there. What was actually there was this: 14 years of service, 8 years in military intelligence. She with a specialization in tactical human intelligence collection that had produced confirmed results in 4 different operational theaters. 2 years embedded with special operations units in advisory and intelligence roles. A classified commendation she was not permitted to discuss in any setting. 3 language qualifications, Pashto, Dari, and Arabic, at professional working proficiency, and a graduate-level background in organizational psychology that she had earned through night classes and online coursework during 2 separate deployments, because she had decided, at some point in her early 30s, that understanding why people do what they do was the only real weapon worth carrying. None of that was visible when she walked across the compound with her uneven stride. All anyone saw was the limp. The all anyone saw was a woman in fatigues who looked like she belonged behind a desk somewhere safe, organizing someone else's paperwork. She had stopped being surprised by this. She had stopped being hurt by it, too, which was a different thing from the same direction. The next morning, she arrived at the Alpha Team briefing room 4 minutes early. The room held 8 people when she walked in, 6 members of the SEAL team, the operations officer, and a signals intelligence specialist named Ortega, who gave her a brief, neutral nod when she sat down. The SEAL team members didn't nod. 2 of them looked at each other with the specific expression that doesn't require words. Taggart was there, at the far end of the table, his arms crossed, his face wearing the comfortable expression of a man who has already decided everything he needs to know about a situation. The briefing began at 0600 exactly. While the operations officer ran through the parameters of the mission, a targeted intelligence collection operation in a contested rural district, time-sensitive, elevated risk profile, requiring both tactical capability and on-the-ground human intelligence analysis in real time. The kind of operation where having someone who could read a room, read a person, and read a subtext simultaneously was not a luxury. It was why she was there. When the operations officer introduced her and explained her role, there was a silence in the room that had texture to it. It wasn't hostile exactly. It was the silence of people who have already decided something and are simply waiting for events to confirm what they believe. Taggart broke it. "With respect," he said, and the 2 words carried everything he actually meant, wrapped inside their polite packaging. "We've run this type of operation before without a civilian intelligence asset. Our team handles the tactical and the analysis on the ground. We know how to read a target environment." He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the operations officer, as though she was a scheduling problem to be resolved rather than a person in the room. Mara Voss did not move, did not shift her weight, did not change her expression. She looked at the briefing materials in front of her, and which she had already read the previous night, through a copy she had obtained through proper channels at least 6 hours before anyone else in that room had seen them. She had spent those 6 hours doing what she always did, not just reading the materials, but pulling the threads underneath them. The regional tribal dynamics, the network of local intermediaries that the previous team had failed to properly map. The pattern of movements in the target area that, read correctly, he told a completely different story than the one the official intelligence assessment had concluded. She had already found the error in the official assessment. A significant one, the kind that left uncorrected would walk 8 people directly into a situation they were not prepared for. She waited until Taggart finished speaking. Then she opened her folder to the 3rd page and slid it into the center of the table without drama. "See, the assessment has the primary contact network wrong," she said. Her voice was level, not cold, not defensive. Level, the way a scalpel is level. Not because it lacks force, but because its force is the precision. "The northern route they've flagged as low risk is being actively monitored by a secondary cell that isn't in the official reporting. This route," she pointed to the map, "is where they'll expect you. This one is where you'll actually get through." Silence. Reeves leaned forward slightly. He looked at the page. His eyes moved across the analysis notes she had written in the margins in her clean, small handwriting. Taggart did not lean forward. He looked at the page from where he sat. Then he looked at the operations officer. Then, finally, for the first time since she had walked into the compound, he looked directly at her. "Where did this come from?" he said. "I built it last night," she said. From the source materials already in the briefing package. They were all there. They just hadn't been cross-referenced correctly. Another silence. This one had different texture. The operations officer picked up the page. Read it. Set it down. picked it up again. His jaw did something complicated. Taggart's arms were still crossed, but his weight had shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way a man shifts when the ground beneath him turns out to be slightly different than he mapped it. Tamara Voss gathered her folder. She had 3 more pages with similar findings. She would get to them in order. She was not in a hurry. She had spent 14 years not being in a hurry, doing the work no one saw in the hours no one was watching, building the kind of credibility that does not announce itself because it does not need to. Outside, the desert wind moved through the compound again. The dust spirals rose and fell. Somewhere across the base, a vehicle engine turned over and caught. She turned to the next page. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can be is someone other people have already decided they understand. Because people who think they know exactly what they're looking at stop watching. They stop paying attention. They move through the world with their conclusions already drawn, and they miss the thing that is happening right in front of them. And the SEAL team across the table had decided what she was the moment she walked across the compound with her uneven stride. They had filed her away under a label that felt comfortable and familiar and required no further thought. They were about to find out that the label was wrong. She turned to the next page and kept working. The ache in her leg was steady and familiar, like an old argument she had already won. She paid it no more attention than that. There was too much to do, and then she had learned to do it anyway, in the desert quiet, while the men who had already written her off were busy being certain about things they didn't yet understand. That certainty was going to be a problem for them very soon. Not for her. Never again for her. They rolled out at 1400 hours, 3 vehicles, 8 team members, and 1 intelligence officer who rode in the second truck without complaint and without conversation, and watching the landscape through a scratched window with the particular quality of attention that people who have learned to survive on information develop after enough years of needing it to stay alive. Taggart rode in the lead vehicle. He had not spoken directly to her since the briefing. The operations officer had accepted her corrected route analysis after a 40-minute consultation with a regional intelligence coordinator who had, in the end, confirmed everything she had laid out. And the route change had been logged, the briefing updated, the plan adjusted. Taggart had received all of this information with the expression of a man eating something he has decided tastes exactly the same as what he expected, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Reeves, who rode in her vehicle, had said 4 words to her since they left the base. He had looked at the window beside her during most of the drive, but twice she had caught him watching her from the corner of his eye. Not the way men on the base had watched her walk across the compound, cataloging and dismissing. This was different. This was the look of someone who is revising a calculation. She noticed it. She noticed everything. That was not arrogance. It was occupational condition. After enough years of walking into rooms where reading the wrong signal correctly could mean the difference between a successful debrief and a catastrophic breach, you stopped being able to turn off the part of your brain that tracked everything simultaneously. It ran quietly in the background like an engine you have forgotten is always on. The landscape outside the window was the color of old bone, pale, dry. It is scattered with low scrub and the occasional compound wall rising from the flat earth like something the ground had pushed up involuntarily. She had been in this region before, 3 years ago, in a different capacity, under a different operational umbrella. The road they were on now was not the road the original plan had used. It was her road. The one she had identified from the cross-referenced source materials in the early hours of the morning while the team had been sleeping. The first checkpoint passed without incident, the second as well. When they reached the third checkpoint, an informal barrier maintained by a local militia faction whose loyalties the official assessment had characterized as stable and cooperative, the lead vehicle slowed. Through the scratched window she watched Taggart's door open. I watched him step out to manage the checkpoint exchange with the controlled confidence of someone who has done this in many countries and believes the method is universal. She opened her door before anyone told her to stay inside. Reeves turned. "Captain, give me 90 seconds, she said, already walking. She did not walk fast. The limp was what it was. But she covered the ground between her vehicle and the checkpoint with the efficiency of someone who is not performing movement, but simply completing it. And she reached the barrier at the moment the lead militia member, a man in his late 50s with a gray-threaded beard and eyes that had the specific flatness of someone who has seen too much negotiation that led nowhere good, was delivering a response to Taggart that carried a tone Taggart did not appear to be correctly reading. Then she stepped in beside Taggart and said 4 words in Pashto, not a greeting, not a pleasantry. 4 specific words that referenced a local land dispute from 3 years prior that she had encountered in a secondary intelligence report that had been attached to the briefing package as supplementary reading. The kind of attachment most people skip because it is labeled historical context and doesn't feel immediately mission relevant. The man's eyes changed, not dramatically, a fraction. And the flatness did not leave entirely, but something behind it shifted, the way the quality of light changes when a cloud moves without the cloud being especially visible about it. He spoke. She listened. She responded. The exchange lasted 6 minutes. At the end of it, the barrier moved aside. Taggart stood 2 feet to her left throughout, understanding the phonetics but not the language, watching a negotiation he had been in the middle of resolve itself through a vector he had not seen coming. So back in the vehicle, Reeves said nothing for a full minute. Then, "What did you say to him?" "I mentioned the water rights agreement that was brokered in this district in 2021, she said. "His family was one of the primary beneficiaries. He's been skeptical of outside military presence since a coalition unit passed through in 2022 and made promises about infrastructure support that were never fulfilled. He needed to know we understood the context before he was going to let us through without sending word ahead." Reeves processed this. "That was in the briefing materials?" "Supplementary reading," she said. "Page 11 of the historical context annex." He was quiet again. Then, "Nobody reads the historical context annex." "I know," she said. She looked back out the window. The checkpoint was shrinking behind them. The road ahead was empty and pale. That's generally a problem." They reached the target area as the sun began its long, flat descent toward the ridgeline in the west, painting the dust in colors that were genuinely beautiful if you were the kind of person who could afford to notice beautiful things in operational environments. Mara Voss was not, at present, that kind of person. She was watching the patterns of movement around the target compound, which structures showed foot traffic, which showed none, and what the vehicle positions communicated about interior activity, which of the 2 men she could see at the compound perimeter was carrying himself with the posture of genuine security detail versus the posture of a man performing the role of security detail for someone else's benefit. The difference was in the hands. She had learned this from a Jordanian intelligence contact named Walid 11 years ago over a meal in Amman. The way a man holds his hands when he is genuinely alert is different from the way a man holds his hands when he wants to appear alert. The genuinely alert man's hands are loose but oriented. The performing man's hands are too still, too deliberate, held slightly away from the body at an angle that is the visual grammar of "I am demonstrating readiness" rather than the genuine article. The man at the northeast corner of the compound was performing. She raised her voice. "The northeast perimeter guard is staged. He's not primary security. Someone put him there to look covered. Your actual exposure point is the western wall. There's a gap in the sightline pattern that the northwest guard can't cover without leaving the gate unmonitored. That's your entry window." She said it to Reeves, who had the tactical radio. She said it without preamble and without the softening language people sometimes use when they are not sure their input will be received. as she had run out of softening language approximately 4 years ago and had not found it necessary to replace it. Reeves looked at the compound, looked at the northeast guard, looked at the western wall. He keyed the radio. Taggart. Change of entry plan. West wall. Captain Voss has eyes on a coverage gap. I'm confirming it from here. There was a pause on the radio that had its own particular quality. In the pause of a man who is deciding whether the cost of accepting information from a source he has not yet reclassified is less than the cost of ignoring information that appears to be correct. Copy, Taggart said. West wall. Confirm timing. She gave them the timing window. 4 minutes, based on the patrol rotation pattern she had been tracking since they arrived. And the Northwest Guard moved on a predictable cycle that left the western approach uncovered for a window she estimated at 90 seconds, enough, for a team of this capability, to be more than adequate. The entry was clean, no contact, no alarm. The team moved through the western wall on her timing to within 4 seconds. Inside the compound, the intelligence collection proceeded. She stayed at the perimeter with Reeves and one other team member, monitoring the external environment, and feeding information through the radio as she read it from the patterns of activity in the surrounding area. A vehicle that slowed on the road 200 meters north and then continued, which she assessed as surveillance behavior rather than transit behavior and communicated as such, triggering a timing adjustment to the extraction that added 3 minutes to the team's schedule inside, but avoided what she calculated as a meaningful risk of compromise. When the team extracted, they did so without contact, without incident, and with the intelligence package intact. The drive back was quieter than the drive in. Not the quiet of tension, but a different kind. The quiet of people who are recalibrating, processing, rearranging their understanding of a situation into a new configuration that matches the evidence better than the old one did. Taggart's voice came over the radio once on the return route. Then he called a halt at a position 2 kilometers from the original planned stop. He had seen something. A vehicle parked at an angle that bothered him. His instinct was good. After 12 years in the field, instincts calcify into something that works, even when the reasoning behind them is hard to articulate. She agreed with the halt. She would have called it herself another 30 seconds later. She did not say that. What she said was, "Good call. And the vehicle's been there long enough to have heat shimmer underneath it. It's not freshly parked. They've been waiting." Taggart came back on the radio. A pause. Then, "Alternate route back." "Yes," she said. They took the alternate route. Clean passage. Base arrival at 2200 hours. Everyone who had left that morning was present for the return. That was, in the business of operations with elevated risk profiles, the most important metric. In the debrief, she presented her findings in the order she had organized them. The room was the same room from the morning briefing, the same 8 people, the same metal chairs, and the same overhead light. But the texture of the room was different. The way the air sits in a room changes when the people in it have spent a day being surprised by the same person in the same direction. She presented her findings clearly, and without emphasis on what had gone differently than the original plan or what had been corrected or adjusted. That was not strategic modesty. She simply understood that the mission outcome was the metric, and the mission outcome had been good, and drawing lines between that outcome and her specific contributions was the kind of accounting that served her ego and nobody else. Taggart listened. He looked at his hands during part of it. He was not a small man, in any sense. Not in size, not in career, not in the weight of his experience. Watching him listen was like watching a structure that had been very confident in its own load-bearing capacity quietly conduct a structural reassessment. At the end of the debrief, he looked up. He did not apologize. Men like Taggart often don't, not with words, because the apology comes in a different currency. In the way they listen from that point forward, in the space they make at the table. and in the absence of the particular dismissiveness they had previously carried as a default setting. She didn't need an apology. She had what she always worked for: the mission result, the team home safe, the intelligence collected. She picked up her folder and left the room. Her leg ached the way it always did at the end of a long day in the field. She let it ache. She had learned the difference between pain that means stop and pain that means you already got through it. And this was the second kind. Tomorrow there would be another briefing, another mission cycle, another room full of people who had already decided what they were looking at before they looked carefully enough. She would walk in with her uneven stride and her canvas bag and her annotated briefing materials, and she would do what she always did: the work, quietly, in the direction of the outcome, until the outcome spoke for itself. It always did. She had learned to be patient enough to let it. 3 weeks into the assignment, the mission that nobody planned for arrived the way those missions always do: not with warning, not with a proper briefing cycle, not with the organized architecture of a scheduled operation. It arrived at 2:17 in the morning as a fragmentary report over an encrypted channel, delivered in the compressed clinical language of people communicating bad information under time pressure, and it required decisions that the normal decision-making structure was not positioned to make quickly enough. The situation was this: a network of local informants that the team had been working to cultivate, people whose cooperation was the product of months of relationship building, of careful trust development, of the slow and genuinely difficult work of convincing people who have been given reasons to distrust outside military presence that this time was different, had been compromised. Not fully. Not yet. But a signal had come through that indicated one of the network's outer nodes had been identified by an opposing faction, and if that node was rolled up, the roll-up would move inward along the network in a pattern that would expose 3 additional contacts within 48 hours, one of whom was a source whose information had been, for the past 4 months, the single most valuable thread in the regional intelligence picture. Losing that source was not just an operational setback. It was the kind of setback that takes years to recover from, that leaves gaps in the intelligence picture that get filled by assumption and approximation until someone makes a decision based on an assumption that turns out to be wrong, and then people die because of what wasn't known. She was the one who received the signal. She was the one who read the pattern correctly. And she was the one, at 2:17 in the morning, in her narrow room with the metal cot and the single overhead light, who understood that the window for preventing the roll-up was not 48 hours. It was 6. She went to Taggart's door first. Not because protocol required it, but because she had learned in the 3 weeks since the first mission that Taggart was the fulcrum. Change the way Taggart was oriented, and the rest of the team moved with him. And he had the kind of gravity that groups develop around certain people, not always by design, not always because of formal rank, but because of something in the quality of his presence that other people read as north and calibrate to. He answered the door in 30 seconds. He had the look of a man who sleeps lightly because light sleeping is a survival strategy he adopted in a country he no longer lived in and never fully switched off. He looked at her face, read something in it. I said nothing and opened the door wider. She laid out the situation in 7 minutes. No preamble, no hedging. The facts, the timeline, the window, the consequence of inaction, the singular option she had identified for preventing the network from unraveling. The option was this: she would go in. Not with the team, not with tactical support. She would make contact with the compromised node directly, alone, using a cover approach she had developed during her earlier tour in the region, a cover that was credible, documented, and had been used in 3 previous intelligence operations with successful results. She would pull the source out of the exposure window before the opposing faction could complete their roll-up. She would do it in the 6 hours they had, and she would do it in a way that preserved the source's network viability instead of burning the entire contact tree to save one node. The alternative was to do nothing and watch the network collapse from the outside, which was cleaner and safer for everyone on the base, and would result in a months-long void in the intelligence picture that she was not willing to be responsible for creating when she could see clearly that it wasn't necessary. Taggart listened to all of it. His face did the thing it had been doing for 3 weeks, the recalibration thing, the structural reassessment thing. And he had been doing it with increasing frequency, she had noticed, which meant either that she kept generating information that required him to update his model, or that he was now genuinely paying attention in a way that naturally surfaces more recalibration triggers. She thought it was probably both. When she finished, he said, "Your leg is not a factor in this operational profile," she said. The answer was ready because she had run it before she walked to his door. Thus, the approach did not require the kind of mobility that would make the leg a limiting variable. It required language fluency, pattern recognition, social cover, and the ability to sit in an uncomfortable room and read the people in it correctly while appearing to be doing something entirely different. Her leg did none of those things. It was irrelevant. Taggart looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away, and she did not fill the silence with additional argument. She had made the case, but the case was sufficient, or it wasn't. "I'm sending Reeves as a standoff support," he said. "He stays back, doesn't enter, but he's there." "Acceptable," she said. "If the timeline moves faster than 6 hours, I'll signal. Reeves will know what to do." She had already thought through the contingency architecture. She gave it to him in 2 minutes. He listened, nodded once. She was out of the base by 3:15. The cover was a documentary researcher working for a regional development organization, a role she had inhabited before with enough consistency that it fit like a garment she had worn in so many specific situations that her body remembered exactly how to carry it. She dressed for the role in the vehicle on the way, changing the way she held herself as much as the clothes, shifting the register of her posture from military precision to the slightly distracted, earnest quality of a person whose primary concern is a research deadline rather than the armed faction that had been tracking the network's outer perimeter. Reeves drove. He said very little. At one point, somewhere on the approach road in the dark, with the headlights cutting a pale corridor through the emptiness, he said, "You've done this before. The cover thing." "Yes," she said. "A lot?" "Enough to be comfortable with it." He was quiet. Then, "What does that feel like?" "Going in without—" He seemed to be looking for the right framing. "Without backup," she said. "Yeah." She considered the honest answer. "It feels like the most focused I ever am," she said. "Everything that isn't relevant to the next 5 minutes goes away. It's very clear." He looked at the road. "Huh," he said. Like the answer had landed somewhere in him, and he was going to need time to locate exactly where. She made contact with the compromise node at 4:42 in the morning. "I'm in a tea house that was open at that hour because several of its regular patrons kept unconventional schedules for unconventional reasons, and the owner had long since stopped asking questions about any of it. The node, a man in his mid-40s named Farhan, an agricultural supplier with a network of contacts that spread through the district in the organic, unmappable way of genuine community relationships, was already nervous when she arrived. And nervous in the way of someone who has felt the shape of a threat without being able to name it yet. The way you feel a change in barometric pressure before you see the storm. She sat across from him. She ordered tea. She spoke to him in Dari, in the register of someone continuing a conversation they had been having for months, which in fact, they had been. She had been one of his contact handlers during her previous tour, a fact that only 3 people in the current operational structure knew. That she was one of them. Farhan was another. The conversation that followed was not dramatic. That was the thing about the work that most people who watched action films did not understand. The moments that changed outcomes most significantly were almost never dramatic. They were quiet. They were two people talking over tea while the rest of the tea house murmured around them. They were the careful navigation of a trust relationship under pressure, the transmission of necessary information in language that would be meaningless to anyone listening, who didn't hold the relevant context, the steady presence of someone who is not panicking in a situation that warrants panic, which is itself the most useful thing you can bring to a person who is on the edge of it. She gave him what he needed to understand about the exposure and the timeline. She gave him the extraction path, not physically extracting him. Nothing that dramatic. But moving him out of the exposure window in a way that made him look like he had drifted away from the network of his own volition, a natural dissolution rather than a burn, which preserved his safety and preserved the network's integrity at the same time. It was the solution that required the most precise handling and the most trust between the two people executing it. And it worked because the trust was there, had been built over years, in the careful way of things that are built to last. She was back at the standoff position where Reeves was waiting by 6:20, 18 minutes inside the 6-hour window. The sun was beginning to define the edge of the horizon in the east, a faint line of brightness against the dark that had the particular quality of very early morning when the world looks like it is deciding whether to continue. Reeves handed her a thermos of coffee without a word. She took it. They sat in the vehicle for a moment in the growing light, and she let herself be tired in a way she hadn't been able to be inside the cover, where tired was a luxury she couldn't carry. "Farhan," Reeves said. "Clear," she said. "The outer node exposure will look like a natural withdrawal. The network holds." He nodded. He was looking at the horizon line. "You know," he said, "when you walked across the compound that first day," he stopped. "I know what you thought," she said. No heat in it, just fact. "Yeah," he said, but he looked at his hands on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry for that." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just don't do it again to the next one." He nodded, looked at the horizon for another moment, started the vehicle. When they returned to base, she went directly to the operations center and filed the full report before she slept. She filed it in the clean, precise language of someone documenting what happened rather than editorializing about what it meant. The facts, the timeline, the outcome, the network status. She did not file a section on how the outcome had been achieved. The methods were in the classified operational notes, available to those with the appropriate clearance. She did not write a section that began with the words, "They almost didn't send me," or "This is what it cost me," or "Look at what I did in the dark while everyone was sleeping." Those were not the kinds of sections that belonged in operational reports. They were also not the kinds of sections that belonged in the story she told herself. She had spent enough years doing the work, quietly, without the architecture of recognition that other people seem to require in order to continue. She had discovered somewhere in those years that the recognition she actually needed was the kind she could not outsource. The kind that came from knowing privately, completely, that she had done what she came to do and done it well, and that the outcome was good because of what she had brought to it, and that the people who came home safe, and the source whose network held, and the intelligence picture that remained intact were the form the recognition took. And that was enough. It had to be enough. She had decided, a long time ago, that it would be. The last thing she did before she left the operations center was check the next mission cycle briefing schedule. And a new operation had been flagged for the following week, more complex than the previous two, higher risk profile, requiring the kind of multi-layered intelligence analysis and real-time decision support that had, 3 weeks ago, seemed to the Alpha team like a capability they neither needed nor were particularly interested in acquiring. She was listed, without a qualifier or a footnote, as a primary team member. She walked back to her quarters in the early morning light, her stride uneven, her left foot landing its familiar half-beat behind. The compound was quiet. A dog barked somewhere past the perimeter wall and then stopped. The dust had settled overnight, and the air was clean in the way desert air gets clean in the early hours, before the day heats up enough to start moving things around again. She lay down on the metal cot. She looked at the overhead light for a moment, which she did not turn on because the light coming through the window was enough. So she thought about the network, intact. She thought about Farhan, clear. She thought about the 6-hour window and the 18 minutes she'd had to spare, which was not much margin, but was margin, and margin was what you worked to build. She did not think about Taggart, or what the team thought now, or how 3 weeks had rearranged whatever calculus they had walked in with. That was their work to do. They would do it, or they wouldn't. Her work was already done, and tomorrow there would be more. She closed her eyes. Outside, the compound was waking up. Vehicles. Voices. The day assembling itself out of its pieces the way all days do, indifferently, without interest in who had been up working in the dark to keep certain things from falling apart. The day does not know what it owes. That's fine. That was always fine. She had never needed the day to know.